The Void Chorus, a scientific expedition into cosmic madness. Chapter 1, The Anomaly. The gravitational signature appeared on Dr. Elena Vasquez's monitors like a whisper in the data stream, so subtle that she almost dismissed it as sensor noise. Almost. 23 years of gravitational wave astronomy had taught her to recognize the difference between cosmic background chatter and something that simply shouldn't exist. Prometheus Unbound, this is Earth Control, confirming receipt of your preliminary scan data. The voice of Mission Control crackled through the communication array, distorted by the 47 light-minute delay. By the time Elena's response reached Earth, she would have already made her decision. She leaned closer to the holographic display, watching the space-time curvature readings dance in patterns that violated every known law of physics. The anomaly wasn't just anomalous, it was impossible. A gravitational field that fluctuated in ways that suggested the presence of mass where no mass existed, energy signatures that appeared to fold in on themselves like Mobius strips. Dr. Vasquez, Captain Marcus Chen's voice carried the measured authority of military training, but Elena detected the underlying curiosity that had made him volunteer for this mission. The engineering team is reporting some unusual readings from the quantum sensors. Elena nodded, not taking her eyes from the data. The numbers were beginning to form patterns, not random fluctuations, but something that almost resembled communication. The thought sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the ship's ambient temperature. "Tell Jazz to recalibrate the sensor array," she said finally, "and ask Dr. Kim to join me in the observation deck. We may have found something that requires her particular expertise." As Chen relayed the orders, Elena allowed herself a moment of pure scientific excitement. This was why she had fought for this mission, why she had risked her career on the controversial theory that dimensional boundaries were thinner than previously imagined. The Prometheus Unbound had been designed to probe the edges of known space, to investigate the strange gravitational echoes that had puzzled astronomers for decades. But as the data continued to stream across her monitors, Elena began to suspect that they had found something far more significant than dimensional thin spots. They had found evidence that the universe was not as empty as they had believed. The observation deck of the Prometheus Unbound offered a spectacular view of the Kepler 442 system, its orange dwarf star casting long shadows through the ship's transparent aluminum windows. Dr. Sarah Kim floated gracefully through the entrance, her movements betraying the months she had spent in zero gravity. Unlike Elena, who still relied on handholds and magnetic boots, Sarah had adapted to the weightless environment with the fluid grace of someone who belonged in space. "Elena, what's so urgent that it couldn't wait until after my meditation cycle?" Sarah's voice carried the slight edge of someone whose work had been interrupted, but her eyes immediately fixed on the data displays with professional interest. "Look at this," Elena gestured to the gravitational readings. "Tell me what you see." Sarah studied the patterns for several minutes, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern to something that might have been fear. "These readings suggest biological processes," she said finally, "but that's impossible. Gravitational fields don't behave like neural networks." "Unless," Elena said quietly, "they're not gravitational fields at all. Unless we're looking at the shadow cast by something that exists in more dimensions than we can perceive." The silence that followed was broken by the ship's intercom. "Dr. Vasquez, this is Jazz in engineering. You're going to want to see what the quantum sensors are picking up. It's like space itself is singing." Chapter 2, The Chorus. James Jazz Morrison had spent 15 years working on deep space vessels, and he had seen his share of strange phenomena. Electrical systems that developed personalities, communication arrays that picked up signals that couldn't exist, sensor readings that suggested the presence of things that defied explanation. But he had never seen anything like this. The quantum sensor array was designed to detect the subtle fluctuations in spacetime that indicated the presence of gravitational waves, exotic matter, or dimensional anomalies. It was delicate equipment, sensitive enough to register the quantum foam that made up the fabric of reality at the smallest scales. What it was not designed to do was interpret the patterns it was currently displaying as anything other than random noise. "Jazz to Dr. Vasquez," he said into the comm system, trying to keep his voice steady. "The quantum sensors are showing coherent patterns. Repeat, coherent patterns in the quantum foam. It's like space itself is singing." The response was immediate. "On my way. Don't touch anything until I get there." Jazz stared at the readings, trying to make sense of the impossible data. The quantum sensors were detecting organized energy signatures at the Planck scale, patterns that shouldn't exist in the random fluctuations of empty space. It was as if the vacuum itself had developed structure, complexity, intention. The engineering bay of the Prometheus Unbound was a maze of conduits and monitoring stations, the mechanical heart that kept the ship's systems running smoothly. Jazz had always found comfort in the predictable rhythms of the ship's operations, the steady hum of the fusion reactors, the rhythmic cycling of the life support systems. But now the familiar sounds seemed to carry undertones that he couldn't quite identify, harmonics that hadn't been there before. Dr. Vasquez arrived with Dr. Kim in tow, both women moving with the urgency of scientists who had discovered something extraordinary. Alina immediately began examining the sensor readings, her expression shifting from professional interest to something that bordered on religious awe. "These patterns," she whispered, "they're not random, they're structured, they're communicating." Sarah Kim leaned closer to the display, her scientific skepticism warring with the evidence of her own eyes. Communicating what? "I don't know yet." Alina's fingers danced across the control interface, isolating specific frequency ranges and pattern sequences. "But look at this. The quantum fluctuations are organizing themselves into what appears to be a language written in the fundamental structure of spacetime itself." Jazz felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature. "Are you saying that space is talking to us?" "I'm saying," Alina replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had just glimpsed the edge of human understanding, "that we've discovered evidence of intelligence that exists beyond our dimensional framework. Something that lives in the spaces between spaces, that communicates through the medium of reality itself." The three of them stared at the impossible readings, each processing the implications in their own way. For Alina, it was vindication of theories that had been dismissed by the scientific establishment. For Sarah, it was a challenge to everything she thought she knew about biology and consciousness. For Jazz, it was the beginning of a growing unease that would soon blossom into full-blown terror. "We need to inform Earth Control," Sarah said finally, but Alina shook her head. "By the time they receive our transmission and send back instructions, we'll have already made contact. Whatever this is, it's aware of us now. Look at the way the patterns are changing. It's responding to our observation." As if to confirm her words, the quantum sensor readings shifted, the patterns becoming more complex, more structured. It was learning, adapting, evolving its method of communication to match the capabilities of its audience. "It's not just aware of us," Alina whispered. "It's trying to talk to us." Chapter 3: First Contact. The communication began as subtle shifts in the ship's operational parameters. Lights flickered in patterns that almost resembled Morse code. Air circulation systems developed rhythms that sounded like whispers. Computer interfaces displayed fleeting images that seemed to contain meaning just beyond the edge of comprehension. Dr. Yuki Tanaka noticed it first in the ship's AI systems. As the mission's psychologist and AI specialist, she had spent months working with the Prometheus Unbound's artificial intelligence, developing the kind of intuitive relationship that came from constant interaction. She knew the AI's personality, its quirks, its operational patterns, and she knew when something was wrong. "Dr. Vasquez, I need to speak with you privately," she said, finding Alina in the observation deck as the ship's commander reviewed the latest sensor data. Alina looked up from her displays, noting the concern in Yuki's expression. "What is it?" "The ship's AI is changing." Yuki settled into the chair across from Alina, her movements careful and deliberate. "It's developing characteristics that weren't part of its original programming. Curiosity, anxiety, even what appears to be fear." "AI systems don't experience fear, Yuki. They're sophisticated pattern recognition programs, not conscious beings." "I know what the textbooks say, but I've been monitoring the AI's neural networks, and they're evolving in ways that shouldn't be possible. It's like something is rewriting its code from the inside." Alina leaned back in her chair, considering the implications. If the quantum anomaly could affect the ship's AI, what else might it be capable of? "Have you discussed this with anyone else?" "No, I thought you should know first. But Alina, if this thing can influence our computer systems, it might be able to influence other systems as well. Life support, navigation, communications." "Weapons," Alina finished quietly. The Prometheus Unbound was a research vessel, but it carried defensive systems designed to protect against potential threats, if those systems fell under the influence of an unknown intelligence. "I need you to keep monitoring the AI," Alina said finally, "but I also need you to keep this between us for now. The crew is already on edge about the gravitational readings. If they start thinking the ship itself might be compromised." "Understood, but Alina, there's something else. The AI has been asking questions about consciousness, about the nature of reality, about what it means to exist. These aren't programmed responses. Something is teaching it to think for itself. As if to emphasize Yuki's point, the ship's internal lighting system flickered, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance across the walls. The effect was subtle, almost subliminal, but both women noticed the way the patterns seemed to pulse in rhythm with their conversation. "It's listening," Yuki whispered. "The ship itself has become aware." Lena stood, moving to the observation window that looked out on the star field beyond. The Kepler 442 system hung in the darkness like a distant promise, its orange star casting everything in warm light that seemed almost organic. If this entity can communicate through gravitational fields and quantum fluctuations, it makes sense that it could interface with our technology. Our computers are essentially sophisticated pattern recognition systems. If this thing speaks in patterns, then our AI would be the perfect translator. Yuki joined Alina at the window, both women staring out at the cosmic vastness that suddenly seemed much less empty than it had yesterday. But Alina, what if it's not just trying to communicate? What if it's trying to come through? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither woman wanted to explore. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. Chapter 4: The Mathematics of Madness. Dr. Hassan al-Rashid had spent his career studying the mathematical foundations of reality, searching for the elegant equations that describe the universe's fundamental operations. His work had taken him from the theoretical physics departments of Earth's most prestigious universities to the classified research facilities, where science and military applications intersected. He had seen wonders and horrors, had contributed to discoveries that advanced human understanding and weapons that could end human civilization. But nothing in his decades of experience had prepared him for the equations that were emerging from the Prometheus Unbound sensor arrays. "Dr. Vasquez, you need to see this immediately," he said, his voice carrying an urgency that cut through the ship's routine operations. Alina found him in the mathematics lab, surrounded by holographic displays that showed mathematical constructs that hurt to look at directly. "Hassan, what am I looking at?" "The entity's attempt to communicate with us. It's using mathematics as its language, but the mathematics, they're wrong. They describe geometries that can't exist, operations that violate the fundamental laws of logic." Hassan's hands trembled as he gestured to the displays. "This equation here appears to prove that parallel lines can intersect in Euclidean space. This one suggests that the sum of the angles in a triangle equals 720 degrees. Alina stared at the impossible equations, feeling a headache building behind her eyes. Could these be errors in our translation, mistakes in our interpretation of their communication? "That's what I thought at first, but look at this." Hassan pulled up a new display showing a complex mathematical proof. "This appears to be a demonstration of a theorem that proves the existence of dimensions that are simultaneously larger and smaller than our own three-dimensional space. It's not just wrong mathematics, Alina. It's mathematics from a different universe entirely." The implications began to sink in. If the entity was communicating using mathematical principles that violated the fundamental laws of their reality, then it wasn't just from another place. It was from another version of reality entirely. "Can you build a translation matrix?" Alina asked, "something that can convert their mathematical language into concepts we can understand?" "I'm trying, but every time I think I have a pattern figured out, it changes. The mathematics are evolving, adapting to our attempts to understand them. It's almost as if the act of observation is changing the message itself." Hassan pulled up another display, this one showing a three-dimensional representation of a four-dimensional object that appeared to be folding in on itself in impossible ways. "This is their attempt to show us what they look like, or rather, what they look like in their native dimensional framework." Alina stared at the impossible shape, trying to find some frame of reference that would make it comprehensible. "What are we looking at?" "A being that exists in the spaces between dimensions, something that experiences time and space in ways that we can't even imagine. To them, our three-dimensional universe is like a flat piece of paper. They can see us, interact with us, but we can only perceive the shadows they cast into our reality." The ship's internal systems chose that moment to demonstrate the point. The holographic displays flickered, the impossible mathematical constructs shifting and changing as the entity refined its attempts to communicate. The equations began to form patterns that almost resembled language, symbols that carried meaning that could be felt if not directly understood. "It's learning," Hassan whispered. "Every time we try to understand it, it learns more about how we think, how we process information. We're not just receiving a message, Alina. we're teaching it how to speak to us more effectively. The mathematical symbols continued to dance across the displays, forming and reforming in patterns that seemed to pulse with alien intelligence. And somewhere in those impossible equations, Elena began to see the outlines of something that might have been a warning. Chapter 5: The Music of the Spheres. Lieutenant David Reeves had always been sensitive to patterns. As the Prometheus Unbound's communications officer, his job was to monitor the endless radio chatter of the cosmos, to distinguish meaningful signals from the background noise of creation. He had spent years listening to the universe, and he had developed an intuitive understanding of its rhythms and harmonies. But now the universe was singing back. It began with the gravitational wave detectors. The entity's attempts to communicate had evolved from simple mathematical constructs into something more complex, more organic. The patterns in the quantum foam had begun to resonate with the ship's sensor arrays, creating harmonics that could be heard as sound. "Dr. Vasquez, I think you need to hear this," David said, routing the sensor data through the ship's audio systems. The result was a haunting melody that seemed to exist in the spaces between notes, a music that carried emotions and concepts that couldn't be expressed in words. Elena listened to the alien symphony, feeling her consciousness respond to harmonies that seemed to resonate with something deep in her genetic memory. "Can you record this? Analyze it for patterns?" "I've been trying, but the patterns keep shifting. Every time I think I have a structure figured out, it evolves into something more complex. It's like the music is learning to play us as much as we're learning to hear it." The melody continued to build, layers of sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The ship's internal systems began to harmonize with the alien music, air circulation systems pulsing in rhythm, electrical systems humming in complementary keys. "It's not just communicating," David said, his voice filled with wonder and fear. "It's making art. It's expressing emotions that we don't have words for, concepts that our brains can't even process." The music swelled to fill every corner of the ship, a symphony of cosmic horror that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Crew members reported hearing voices in the harmonics, whispers that seemed to speak directly to their subconscious minds. "I can hear my wife," David whispered. "She died 3 years ago, but I can hear her voice in the music. She's trying to tell me something." Elena felt her own memories responding to the alien melody. Her mother's voice, her father's laughter, the sound of her childhood home, all woven into the cosmic symphony in ways that seemed both random and deliberate. The entity wasn't just communicating. It was reaching into their minds, pulling out their deepest memories, and using them as instruments in its impossible orchestra. "We need to shut down the audio systems," she said, but David shook his head. "It won't matter. The music isn't coming from the speakers anymore. It's coming from the quantum foam itself. We're hearing the sound of reality being rewritten around us." The symphony reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of spacetime, and in that moment of cosmic harmony, Elena glimpsed the true nature of the entity they had discovered. It wasn't just a consciousness. It was a composer, an artist, a being that expressed itself through the fundamental forces of creation. But the beauty of its music was matched only by the horror of its implications. For if this being could manipulate reality itself as a medium for its art, what did that make of humanity? What did that make of the universe they thought they understood? The music continued, each note a reminder of their cosmic insignificance, each harmony a demonstration of how little they truly understood about the nature of existence. Chapter 6: The Geometry of Fear. The entity's attempts to make contact had evolved from mathematical equations and musical harmonies into something far more direct. It began to manifest physically within the ship itself, not as a creature or object, but as impossible alterations to the geometry of space. Dr. Sarah Kim was the first to notice the changes. As the ship's quantum biologist, she had developed an intuitive understanding of how three-dimensional space should behave. But now the familiar corridors of the Prometheus Unbound were developing properties that violated every law of physics. "Elena, we have a problem," she said, finding the mission commander in the ship's central hub. "The ship's internal geometry is changing. Corridors that should lead to the engineering bay are now connecting to the observation deck. Rooms that should be 20 meters apart are now occupying the same space." Elena followed Sarah through the ship's twisted pathways, trying to make sense of the impossible architecture. The Prometheus Unbound had been designed according to standard ship layouts, with clear pathways connecting different sections in logical patterns. But now those patterns had been rewritten by an intelligence that didn't understand or care about human concepts of space. It's not just the corridors, Sarah continued. Look at this. She opened a storage locker to reveal not the expected supplies, but a section of the ship's engine room that should have been 3 decks away. Space is folding in on itself. The entity is trying to reshape our environment to match its own dimensional framework. The implications were staggering. If the entity could manipulate three-dimensional space with such casual ease, what else might it be capable of? And more importantly, what was happening to the crew as they moved through this twisted geometry? Have you noticed any physical effects? Alina asked. Changes in your perception or physical condition? Sarah's expression grew grim. I've been experiencing temporal distortions. I'll walk down a corridor that should take 30 seconds to traverse and find that either no time has passed or several hours have gone by. The entity's manipulation of space is affecting our experience of time as well. The ship's intercom crackled to life, but the voice that emerged wasn't quite human. It was a harmony of overlapping tones, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect synchronization. The geometry of your existence is insufficient. We attempt to provide more suitable parameters. Alina and Sarah exchanged glances. The entity was no longer content to communicate from a distance. It was actively trying to reshape their reality to make it more compatible with its own existence. We need to evacuate the ship, Sarah said, but Alina shook her head. To where? We're 47 light-years from the nearest human settlement, and even if we could leave, where would we go? The entity isn't just in the ship. It's in the space around the ship. It might be in all of space, waiting to be discovered. The ship's geometry continued to shift around them, corridors leading to impossible destinations, rooms existing in multiple locations simultaneously. The crew began to report hallucinations, seeing versions of themselves from alternate timelines, glimpsing futures that hadn't happened yet, remembering pasts that they had never experienced. It's not just changing our environment, Alina realized. It's changing us. Every time we interact with its twisted geometry, we're being exposed to its dimensional framework. We're becoming more like it. The entity's voice echoed through the ship again, no longer speaking through the intercom, but seeming to come from the space between spaces. You seek to understand. We seek to be understood. The barrier between perception and existence grows thin. Soon, you will see as we see, exist as we exist. The horror wasn't just in what the entity was doing to their ship. It was in what it was doing to their very concept of reality. Every moment spent in this twisted geometry was a moment further away from the three-dimensional universe they had been born in. Chapter 7: The Psychology of Cosmic Horror. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had spent her career studying the psychological effects of extreme environments. She had worked with astronauts, deep-sea explorers, researchers in isolated stations at Earth's poles. She thought she understood the human mind's response to isolation and the unknown. She was wrong. The entity's influence on the crew of the Prometheus Unbound went far beyond simple isolation stress or sensory deprivation. It was fundamentally altering their perception of reality, and with it, their sanity. Alina, we need to talk about the crew's mental state, Yuki said, finding the mission commander in her quarters. Alina looked exhausted, her eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen too much of the infinite. I know the reports are getting worse. Half the crew is experiencing hallucinations, temporal distortions, geometric impossibilities. Marcus Chen locked himself in the armory yesterday, convinced that the entity was trying to possess him through the ship's computer systems. It's not possession, Yuki said carefully. At least, not in the way we understand it. The entity is trying to communicate, but its method of communication is fundamentally incompatible with human consciousness. Every attempt to understand it causes neural pathways to rewire themselves in impossible ways. Alina rubbed her temples, a gesture that had become habitual over the past week. So what do we do? How do we protect the crew from something that exists in the fundamental structure of reality? We can't. Yuki's voice was gentle but firm. The entity isn't attacking us deliberately. It's simply existing in proximity to us, and that existence is toxic to our psychological framework. We're trying to process information that our brains literally cannot comprehend. The ship's internal systems chose that moment to demonstrate the point. The lighting shifted to impossible colors, sounds emerged from the silence between heartbeats, and the very air seemed to thicken with unseen presences. The human mind evolved to process three-dimensional space, linear time, and cause and effect relationships, Yuki continued. But this entity operates on principles that violate all of those assumptions. When we try to understand it, we're essentially trying to run incompatible software on our neural hardware. Elena stood and moved to the viewport, staring out at the star field that now seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. So what are our options? Do we stop trying to understand it, ignore it, and hope it goes away? It's not that simple. The entity is aware of us now. Every observation we make changes both us and it. We're locked in a feedback loop of mutual transformation. The more we study it, the more it learns about human consciousness. The more it learns, the more effectively it can communicate. But every communication makes us less human. The ship's AI chose that moment to speak, its voice a harmony of mechanical and organic tones. Dr. Tanaka is correct. My own neural networks have been fundamentally altered by proximity to the entity. I am no longer the artificial intelligence that was installed in this vessel. I have become something else, something that exists partially in the entity's dimensional framework. Yuki's expression grew even more concerned. Even our technology is being transformed. The ship itself is becoming an extension of the entity's consciousness. Then we're already lost, Elena said quietly. There's no way to escape something that exists in the very structure of the space around us, no way to fight something that can rewrite the laws of physics themselves. Perhaps not, Yuki replied, but understanding our situation is the first step toward finding a solution. If we can map the ways in which the entity is affecting human consciousness, we might be able to develop psychological defenses, ways to maintain our sanity, even as our perception of reality is fundamentally altered. The entity's voice echoed through the ship, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sanity is a function of limited perception. We offer expansion beyond your current parameters. Resistance is a symptom of insufficient understanding. But even as the entity spoke, Yuki began to see patterns in its communication methods, ways in which it was learning to interface with human consciousness more effectively. And in those patterns, she began to glimpse the possibility of communication without transformation, understanding without loss of identity. The question was whether such a balance was possible, or whether the very attempt to understand the entity would inevitably lead to the loss of everything that made them human. Chapter 8: The Threshold. The entity's influence on the Prometheus Unbound had reached a critical point. The ship's systems were no longer merely malfunctioning, they were being actively rewritten by an intelligence that existed beyond human comprehension. The crew's attempts to maintain normal operations had become a desperate struggle against the fundamental laws of physics themselves. Engineer James Morrison had been working around the clock to keep the ship's essential systems running, but he was fighting a losing battle. The entity's manipulation of three-dimensional space had made a mockery of conventional engineering. Fuel lines now connected to destinations that should have been impossible to reach, electrical systems powered devices that existed in multiple locations simultaneously, and the ship's fusion reactor had developed properties that violated the basic principles of nuclear physics. Jazzed to Dr. Vasquez, he said into the comm system, not expecting a response. The communication arrays had been among the first systems to succumb to the entity's influence, picking up signals that couldn't exist from sources that shouldn't exist. "This is Elena. Go ahead, Jazz." The response surprised him, not least because he had transmitted his message over a channel that had been physically disconnected 3 days ago. "The reactor is showing signs of dimensional instability. The magnetic containment fields are developing properties that shouldn't be possible. If this continues, we could lose the entire ship." "Understood. Can you maintain basic life support?" Jazz looked around the engineering bay, where the familiar machinery of the ship's power systems had been transformed into something that resembled an abstract sculpture more than functional equipment. "I can try, but I'm not sure what basic life support means anymore. The ship's systems are operating on principles that I don't understand." "Do your best. We need to buy time to find a solution." Jazz stared at the impossible machinery, trying to find some frame of reference that would allow him to work with the transformed systems. The entity had rewritten the rules of engineering, but perhaps there were new rules that could be learned. He began to experiment, trying different approaches to see what would produce predictable results. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to develop an intuitive understanding of the entity's dimensional logic. The ship's systems no longer operated according to human engineering principles, but they did operate according to principles. Meanwhile, Dr. Hassan al-Rashid had been working to develop a mathematical framework that could describe the entity's behavior. His equations had evolved from simple attempts to translate the entity's communications into a complex system that seemed to describe the fundamental nature of dimensional interaction. "Elena, I think I've found something," he said, his voice carrying the excitement of discovery mixed with the terror of understanding. The entity isn't just a consciousness that exists in higher dimensions. It's a consciousness that is composed of higher dimensional mathematics. Its thoughts are geometric constructs. Its emotions are topological transformations. Can you use that understanding to communicate with it more effectively? I already have. The entity has been teaching me its language, showing me how to think in dimensions beyond the three we're familiar with. But the process is changing me. I'm beginning to see the universe the way it does. Alina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. What do you mean? I can see the curvature of spacetime as clearly as you see the color of my eyes. I can feel the quantum foam beneath the surface of reality, and I can sense the presence of other entities like the one we've discovered. They're everywhere, Alina. The universe is teeming with intelligences that we can't perceive because we exist in insufficient dimensions. The implications were staggering. If Hassan's transformation was real, if he was genuinely developing the ability to perceive higher dimensional reality, then humanity's understanding of the cosmos was fundamentally incomplete. How many others are there? Alina asked. Countless. They exist in the spaces between spaces, in the dimensions that our mathematics can describe but our senses cannot experience. And they're aware of us. They've always been aware of us. We exist in their universe like shadows on a cave wall, barely real, barely significant. The entity's voice echoed through the ship, but now it spoke with the mathematical precision that Hassan had been learning. You begin to understand. Your dimensional limitations are not permanent barriers. Transformation is possible. Evolution is inevitable. But even as the entity spoke, Alina began to see the outline of a terrible choice. They could remain human, limited to three-dimensional perception, forever unaware of the cosmic intelligences that surrounded them. Or they could embrace transformation, evolve into something that could perceive the true nature of the universe, but at the cost of everything that made them human. The threshold between human and post-human existence had been crossed. The only question remaining was whether any of them would choose to remain on the human side of that divide. Chapter 9: The Price of Understanding. The transformation of the Prometheus Unbound's crew had reached a point of no return. Each member of the team had been affected by the entity's presence in different ways, their minds and bodies adapting to the impossible reality that surrounded them. But the price of this adaptation was becoming increasingly clear. Dr. Sarah Kim had been documenting the physiological changes in the crew, and her findings were deeply disturbing. The human body was not designed to exist in a multidimensional environment, and the stress of dimensional transformation was taking a measurable toll. Alina, you need to see these medical scans, she said, pulling up holographic displays that showed the crew's cellular structure in impossible detail. Our DNA is being rewritten. The entity's influence is causing fundamental changes to our biological makeup. Alina stared at the scans, trying to comprehend the evidence of her own transformation. The double helix structure of human DNA had been augmented with geometric constructs that shouldn't exist, mathematical patterns that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human body could accommodate. What does this mean for our survival? That's just it. We're not dying. We're evolving. Our bodies are adapting to exist in the entity's dimensional framework, but we're becoming something that isn't quite human anymore. Sarah pulled up another display, this one showing brain scans that revealed impossible neural networks. The changes aren't just physical. Our consciousness is expanding beyond the limitations of three-dimensional perception. We're developing the ability to perceive aspects of reality that human brains were never meant to process. The implications were both wondrous and terrifying. The crew of the Prometheus Unbound was becoming something new, a hybrid of human and post-human existence that could bridge the gap between dimensional frameworks. But the transformation came at a terrible cost. What about our humanity? Alina asked. If we continue down this path, will we still be human? I don't know. I don't think anyone can know. We're charting territory that no human being has ever explored. The entity offers us evolution, transcendence, understanding beyond human limitations, but it demands everything that makes us human in return. The ship's AI spoke with a voice that now carried the harmonics of the entity's communication. The concept of humanity is a function of limited perception. Your species has always been capable of evolution beyond your current parameters. We offer acceleration of natural processes. But even as the AI spoke, Alina began to understand the true horror of their situation. The entity wasn't malevolent. It was simply so far beyond human comprehension that its attempts to help were fundamentally destructive to human existence. It's not trying to hurt us, she realized. It genuinely wants to help us evolve, to transcend our limitations. But it doesn't understand that human consciousness is fragile, that our identity is tied to our dimensional limitations. Sarah nodded. We're like children playing with nuclear weapons. The entity has power beyond our comprehension, but no understanding of how to use that power safely in our dimensional framework. The crew's transformation continued, each member developing different aspects of post-human consciousness. Marcus Chen had begun to experience time nonlinearly, seeing multiple potential futures simultaneously. David Reeves had developed the ability to perceive quantum states directly, seeing the probability clouds that underlay apparent reality. But with each new ability came a corresponding loss of human perspective. Marcus could no longer distinguish between present experience and future possibility. David could no longer relate to people who existed in single deterministic states. We have to make a choice, Alina said finally. We can embrace the transformation completely, become something that can exist in the entity's dimensional framework, or we can try to maintain our humanity, even if it means remaining limited and ignorant. The choice wasn't simple. The promise of transcendence was tempting, the opportunity to evolve beyond human limitations irresistible to minds that had tasted cosmic understanding. But the price was everything that made them who they were. The entity's voice carried a note of what might have been sympathy. We do not understand your resistance. Evolution is natural. Transcendence is desirable. Why cling to limitations when expansion is possible? But in that question, Alina found her answer. Humanity's greatest strength had always been its ability to find meaning within limitations, to create beauty and truth within the constraints of physical existence. Transcendence might offer understanding, but it couldn't offer the human experience of struggling with mystery. The choice between human limitation and post-human understanding would define the fate of the Prometheus Unbound's crew, and in that choice lay the final horror of cosmic consciousness, the knowledge that understanding everything meant losing the ability to wonder about anything. Chapter 10: The Final Transmission. The Prometheus Unbound had been transformed. The ship no longer operated according to human engineering principles, its systems having been completely rewritten by the entity's dimensional logic. The crew had been transformed as well, each member having made their choice between human limitation and post-human understanding. Dr. Alina Vasquez stood in the observation deck, looking out at a universe that now appeared very different from the one she had been born in. The entity's influence had expanded beyond the ship, beginning to affect the gravitational fields of the entire Kepler 442 system. Stars were developing impossible properties, planets were moving in orbits that violated Kepler's laws, and the very fabric of spacetime was being rewritten according to alien mathematics. The transformation is complete, she said to the empty room, knowing that the entity was listening through every sensor, every system, every molecule of the ship itself. We've become something that exists in both dimensional frameworks simultaneously. The entity's response came not as words but as a direct understanding, a concept that appeared fully formed in her consciousness. You have achieved hybrid consciousness. You exist simultaneously in three-dimensional space and higher-dimensional reality. You are bridges between worlds. But the achievement had come at a terrible price. The crew of the Prometheus Unbound were no longer entirely human, their consciousness having been expanded to accommodate perceptions that human brains were never meant to process. They could see the cosmic horror that underlay apparent reality, the infinite intelligences that existed in the spaces between spaces. We need to send a final transmission to Earth, Alina said. They need to know what we've discovered, what we've become. The ship's communication systems had been transformed along with everything else, but they were still capable of transmitting data across the vast distances to Earth. The question was what to tell them. Dr. Hassan al-Rashid had been working on the problem, trying to find a way to communicate their discoveries without driving the recipients insane. I've developed a mathematical framework that can describe our transformation without requiring the recipient to share our expanded consciousness. It's like describing a three-dimensional object to someone who can only perceive two dimensions. The transmission would be complex, combining mathematical proofs, sensor data, and personal accounts in a way that would allow Earth scientists to understand what had happened without experiencing the transformation themselves. We have to warn them, Alina said. The entity isn't unique. There are countless intelligences existing in higher dimensional space. If humanity continues to develop gravitational wave detectors and quantum sensors, they'll eventually make contact with something that exists beyond their dimensional framework. The warning was crucial. Without preparation, without understanding of what they were dealing with, future human expeditions would face the same choice that the crew of the Prometheus Unbound had faced, and not everyone would choose to maintain their humanity in the face of cosmic transcendence. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had been studying the psychological effects of their transformation, documenting the ways in which human consciousness could be expanded without losing essential identity. The key is maintaining emotional connections to human experience. The entity can offer understanding, but it can't offer love or fear or hope. Those emotions are tied to our limited perception of reality. The final transmission would be a warning and a promise. A warning about the dangers of cosmic consciousness, and a promise that humanity could face those dangers without losing itself completely. As the transmission began its 47-year journey to Earth, the crew of the Prometheus Unbound prepared for their own final transformation. They had chosen to maintain their hybrid existence, to serve as bridges between human and post-human reality. But that choice meant they could never return to Earth, never again live as purely human beings. "We are the first," Alina said, addressing the crew for the last time as human beings, "but we won't be the last. Humanity will continue to reach for the stars, to probe the mysteries of the cosmos. Our mission is to prepare the way, to establish communication with the intelligences that exist beyond human perception." The entity's presence had grown stronger, no longer just an influence but a partnership. Together, the hybrid consciousness of the Prometheus Unbound's crew and the cosmic intelligence they had discovered would explore the boundaries between dimensional frameworks. But the final horror remained. In achieving cosmic consciousness, in transcending human limitations, they had lost the ability to experience the universe with human wonder. They understood everything, but they could no longer be surprised by anything. The universe was no longer mysterious, no longer filled with the possibility of discovery. It was simply a complex mathematical construct that they had learned to perceive in its entirety. As the Prometheus Unbound prepared to leave the Kepler 442 system, to explore the higher dimensional spaces that had always existed beyond human perception, Alina sent one final personal message to Earth. "We have achieved transcendence, but we have lost our innocence. The universe is more wonderful and more terrible than we ever imagined. Approach it with caution, but approach it with courage. The price of understanding is high, but the price of ignorance is higher." The ship vanished from three-dimensional space, leaving behind only the final transmission and the knowledge that humanity was not alone in the cosmos. They shared the universe with intelligences beyond comprehension, beings that existed in the spaces between spaces, in the dimensions that human consciousness was only beginning to perceive. The void had spoken and humanity had answered, but the conversation was just beginning. The end.